been around the block as I have, you know that every 4 years they say it's the most important election. There's never been more at stake. So I've heard that before. This time I know it's true, and I think you all do too. This country right now is experiencing not one, not two, not three, but 4 overlapping crises. We have the climate crisis, and in case anyone thinks that's been knocked off of center stage, look at the horrific wildfires that we've seen in California and the Pacific Northwest states. We have the COVID crisis, which now looks like in the month of October, we are going to experience our 3rd spike in that deadly pandemic. We have the racial equity crisis. And just look at what happened in Kentucky when a grand jury decided not to hold accountable policemen who burst into an innocent woman's home and murdered her in the middle of the night. And the crisis of economic inequality. And in case anyone needs any recent reminder of that, I don't know if people saw the New York Times story today that indicated that certain hedge fund and venture capital investors were privy to private information about the severity of the COVID crisis, that the public wasn't given the same information, giving these people the opportunity to manipulate and take advantage of that information for their own private benefit. And we also witnessed yesterday a Supreme Court nominee who claimed throughout that she was independent-minded. She couldn't even answer honestly a question about whether climate change was real. Didn't even show enough independence of mind to say what countless other judges in their decisions have acknowledged, that climate change is real. So we face unbelievable problems in this country, and so much is at stake in this election. So what we want to do today is talk about what UCS is doing to boost turnout and make sure people vote. And by the way, I should just reiterate, UCS is a so-called 501c3 organization, so we don't back particular candidates, but we are allowed to and will vigorously engage in efforts to get out the vote. Although we can't say vote for X or vote for Y, but we can certainly encourage people to vote. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit today. And we're also going to talk about efforts that we have undertaken in partnership with others to protect the integrity of the election. So we have 2 great panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce both of them now, and then I'll hand over the mic to them. I first want to introduce Melissa Varga. She is the Science Network Community Manager and Partnerships Coordinator, and she'll speak about what UCS is doing to encourage voter turnout. And then we'll have Andy Rosenberg, the Director of the Center of Science and Democracy. And one final piece I want to make the point is, as important as this election is, the one 4 years ago also seemed awfully important. And surprisingly, about 30% of people who were UCS members and supporters didn't vote in that election, which is really quite shocking to me. So one of our goals is to make sure that everyone who has a connection to our organization and the scientific community at large has much higher turnout levels than we saw in 2016. So without further ado, Melissa, I'd love to turn it over to you, and you can tell our listeners what we're doing to turn out the vote.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ken. I'm just gonna share some slides with you all. I'm excited to talk with you today about, and to give you sort of a behind the scenes look at how we're approaching voter mobilization at UCS, and share some best practices with you to help you get out the vote in the final few days and weeks before the election. Some of you may have noticed that our communications to you this year about the election are different than what we've sent in the past. Namely, we're talking to you a lot more about the election. You should have started receiving emails from us in the spring about primaries, and then ramping up again in August, talking about voter registration deadlines, voting by mail, and making a plan to vote. So we've made a commitment as an organization that we really want to make sure all of our members who are eligible to vote do so this year, as Ken mentioned. And I wanted to share a little bit of our strategy with you about how we're doing that, sort of pulling back the curtain on our approach so that you can use some of these best practices and ideas in your own communications. So we were able to run analytics that showed that 77.6% of UCS supporters voted in 2016. As Ken mentioned, there were still a lot of people who didn't vote, but I will say that this is much higher than the national average, so good job, thank you. In our emails this year, we're sharing this number, but also letting people know we really do want to get to that 100% of eligible voters within our supporter network. Research around what increases voter turnout indicates that talking about voting as a social norm, something that everyone is doing, supports higher voter turnout. People don't want to be left out. They want to be part of that in crowd. So talking about how many people are voting and striving for even higher turnout makes it more likely that people will show up. So that's why we're talking about that number so much. We're focusing also on two main resources to help people make their voting plans. We're using Science Rising's Turbo Vote tool as a one-stop shop for registering to vote, checking your registration, requesting a mail-in ballot, and signing up for important election-related updates and reminders. Turbo Vote is run by Democracy Works, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit. They've made it really easy for people to use the tool and get the information that they need. So if you haven't checked it out yet, I recommend it. I'll share the link in the chat after this. The second resource is healthyvoting.org. This has state-by-state guidance you can search through that includes information about early voting and voting in person and how to do it safely based on the CDC recommendations. And there are so many resources out there with information about voting that it can be really overwhelming to know where to look and where to begin. So that's why we've focused on just two that we're including in all of our communications with our members and supporters. Both of these websites are nonpartisan, respected resources, and they have staff on hand who are able to make last-minute updates if there are changes to deadlines or requirements or anything else. So I recommend that you use these tools as well. If you're looking for some ways to apply those resources, you can check out our UCS election countdown for a range of activities that you can do that will make an impact. And these range from short yet impactful actions like sharing voting resources on social media to larger activities that allow you to engage friends or community members, like hosting a virtual voter registration drive if that deadline hasn't passed for you yet, or signing up to be a poll worker or election protection volunteer if you're able to. Plus, there's a whole lot of other activities on the list. And we have resources and tools to support you in whichever activity you choose once you sign up. We're also raising awareness about what we can realistically expect on election night. Because of the huge increase in vote by mail and early voting this year, I think when I checked this morning, we were at something like 16 million ballots have already been cast, which is fantastic. It's very possible we won't know the results of many races on election night. So we have a collection of fantastic blogs on our website that talk about various aspects of this and what to expect. And you may have seen us reference this in our voting related emails as well. As part of our work on voting rights, we've also developed resources to help make sure that people know what their rights are and how to stand up for them. and how to combat election disinformation if they come across it. Again, you can check out the link at the bottom here, and I'll post it in the chat later. But we have some guides that include step-by-step how to identify disinformation and to push back against it in ways that actually, sort of defeat that disinformation, and you're not perpetuating the voter suppression tactics that are unfortunately out there. And this is just sort of a sneak preview. Andrew is going to talk more about this work too. I also wanted to share some examples about how UCS is working with other organizations to get out the vote through Science Rising. Science Rising is a network of partners and advocates who are fighting for science, equity, and justice in our democracy leading up to the 2020 election. UCS is a founding partner of Science Rising, and we're working with groups like March for Science, 500 Women Scientists, and Students Learn, Students Vote Coalition to help reach the broader scientific community to make sure that they're showing up to vote this election. We're trying to spread the positive message that STEM students are rising up and engaging at higher rates than ever before. And this is true based on what I've seen, at least. STEM students are much more engaged this election cycle. And we're trying to focus on that positive message because you may have heard that historically STEM majors have voted at the lowest rates of any academic major. So not only do we want to change that, but we're trying to focus on the best practice I mentioned earlier of emphasizing voting as the social norm. Hopefully through the combined efforts of UCS and our partners, we will see an increase in STEM voter turnout, student voter turnout in 2020. One simple yet effective activity that both UCS and Science Rising are featuring is recruiting 3 friends or family to vote. And this works because people still see their friends and family members as trusted messengers at a time when the media and politicians and institutions, people just don't seem to have much trust in them, but people do still listen to their friends in close social networks. So this activity really is straightforward. You ask your friends to commit to voting in the election, and then set yourself a reminder to follow up with them as it gets closer to make sure that they've requested and sent back their mail-in ballot or made a plan to vote in person. And another reason I love this is because you could ask those 3 friends to recruit 3 more friends and really have a multiplier effect. The final idea I wanted to share with you is about civic engagement in the classroom. Even if you're not in academia right now, if you know students, faculty, TAs, campus administrators, or if you're an alum, you can share this information and make sure that civic engagement is being discussed in the classroom. Given that so many campuses are online this year, campus civic engagement looks a lot different than it normally does. Normally, students hear about voting from a lot of in-person activities in residence halls or from student clubs on campus, at campus events. But without that in-person connection, it's even more important that students are hearing about voting in the classroom from their professors. And research has shown that even a simple 5-minute presentation in class can increase registration and turnout. So we've created resources for both faculty to share resources with their students and guidance on how students can ask their professors to include resources in their syllabi or class presentations. And this also addresses one of our long-term goals at UCS of building a culture of science advocacy and engaged scientist advocates. By talking about voting everywhere, including in STEM classrooms, we're normalizing the idea that science is connected to policy and elections and getting students involved at an early age. So this was just a snapshot of some of the ways we're mobilizing folks like you to get out the vote this year. If you're looking for more ways to get involved, definitely check out that UCS election countdown that I mentioned, or the Science Rising Challenge. Both of those have a list of activities, but we'll also have resources and tools to make sure that you can complete those activities effectively. And now I'm going to hand it over to Andy, who's going to talk more about our voting rights and election integrity work.
Thank you, Melissa. And I should say for all of you, Melissa's been a real leader for us in creating Science Rising, and along with Reina Garcia, leading the Science Rising effort over the past year, and other staff within the Center for Science and Democracy that I lead, Tofika Latipo, Michael Latner, who's a senior fellow, and others have been, Daniel Fox, have been deeply engaged in our work on both voting rights and now the elections themselves. So I want to talk a little bit about the research that has been led by Professor Michael Latner, who's at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, with regard to voting rights and how we can secure the coming election. And I put in the chat for this call a link to a Scientific American article that Mike Latner has written along with the blogs on our website that is sort of a political scientist view of the coming election. So Mike Latner's research area and the focus of his writing is on the science of elections. So as part of the Center for Science and Democracy, we wanted to take a UCS approach to the elections, to voting rights, and so on. So we come at it as the science of elections. And initially, his work showed that the loss of voting rights in communities actually is closely related to poor health outcomes in those same communities. And that's actually a causal model. It's not just correlational. That shows that when you lose voting rights, then the policy actions that are taken by the elected officials then aren't serving those people whose voting rights were lost, mostly Black communities, Indigenous communities, other Latinx or communities of color. And it was important for UCS to make that link because many of the organizations that we work with, for example, the Brennan Center or the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, are deeply experienced in working on voting rights, fundamentally from the perspective of civil rights or fairness. But our perspective is from the science of elections. Now, if we look at what's happening in the current election, because of the pandemic, there's been a wholesale change in the way that the election is being conducted. And working through a coalition of 160 organizations called the Declaration for American Democracy, we have been continually pushing a message that says to have a safe election, we need to have extended voting period, vote by mail with the capability to actually verify mail ballots and have a strong signature or other verification structure, and many more places where people can potentially vote or drop off ballots and so on. And you can see around the country there are places that are trying to restrict the number of drop boxes, for example, or those that are reducing the number of polling places. And the polling places that they're reducing are targeted at, again, communities of color, Black communities, Indigenous communities, and so on, to make it much harder to vote. And that does tend to be partisan, although I'd have to say that a lot of the efforts around mail-in voting, it's unclear what its partisan impact will be. It just disadvantages everyone if you call into question mail-in voting or make it more difficult by putting additional restrictions in place, such as in North Carolina. So we have continued to research what are the measures that are well known in the political science community that can strengthen the capacity of states to have a fair and full election and have the results in a timely manner. And so all but a few states, all but 6 states actually will count ballots as they come in, which means they will be following the progress of the election and not have some massive backlog to start counting on election night. Unfortunately, some of the exceptions are places like Pennsylvania and Michigan that are particularly critical in this year's election. But even now, we're starting to see a little bit of change in the rules in those states to allow election officials to get ahead of the number of absentee and mail-in ballots that will come in. Of course, no excuse absentee voting is critical, along with mail-in voting and extended voting hours and more polling places. We also, so we're monitoring those places, but we also are monitoring critical counties around the country that are high population, potentially can be swing counties for a particular state, for example, in Pennsylvania or Ohio. And when I say we're monitoring, we're using databases that are tracking the number of mail ballots that have been sent out, the number that have been returned, and the number that have been rejected on a county by county basis. And actually, we are working with grassroots organizations, and UCS staff are volunteering to call county offices on a daily basis to check the progress of the vote, because we want to know where there are problems occurring, particularly on rejected ballots. So in general, the number of ballot rejections is rejected that come in by mail is quite low historically. But every once in a while, you'll find a county that has double the level of rejection. And there's no real reason that you would imagine in one particular county, people wouldn't be filling out the ballots as well as in another county. It's because an election official is applying a different standard. And so we've seen that in Ohio, for example, where there have been a few counties that have a much higher rejection rate on ballots, even though the rules are the same. And again, there's no reason to suppose that the voters in that area know those rules any less well. And so, and we look at the demographics of those counties, and we find that there is a higher rejection rate, not only in Ohio, but in North Carolina and in other places, a higher rejection rate for Black voters, Indigenous voters, and sometimes Latinx voters than there is for white voters. And again, that's because of the way that election officials are handling the ballots and deciding who is rejected. Now, in many cases, the information about what to do if your ballot is rejected, or even how to know whether your ballot is rejected, is difficult to come by. So we're again working with grassroots organizations like the Community of Black Churches in Cleveland and a woman named Keisha Crum, who is an organizer there, to have voters call and check whether their mail-in ballot was received, whether it was rejected, and if it was rejected, how can they fix it before the final vote is taken. And so in as many people as possible, their vote actually counts, and they know that it counts, because people generally feel very deeply, if they did go and vote, they want their vote to be counted. And in fact, that information is required to be provided by law, even though some places are not necessarily aggressively providing the information to voters as they should be. So we're continuing to monitor on a real-time basis. We will do that right up through the election to try to understand where there have been problems. Every state has some experience with mail-in ballots, so there isn't any place that doesn't know how to do this. Of course, there are some places like Colorado and Washington and Oregon that have had excellent experience with mail-in votings, with very few mail-in voting and very few problems. So we have good information about what actually is occurring. And that's important to combat misinformation, as Melissa mentioned. There is a lot of misinformation out there about mail-in voting, also about extended voting hours. There are too many stories in the press about how it takes someone 8 hours to vote or 7 hours to vote. That is true in isolated places, but that's not the usual experience. And we don't want people to be getting the impression that if you want to vote in person, then you have to spend your entire day, take a day off of work, even if you're working from home, so that you go and stand in line in the rain for hours and hours. I know that makes a good news story, but in many places, voting, can be a matter of minutes or an hour. And there are those few isolated cases because of measures that have been put in place in places like Georgia and Texas to make it more difficult for people to vote. We've also seen some other organizations like sports teams that have stepped up and opened up voting places in stadiums to allow people to distance, to allow people to really vote. And that's great. We've never really seen anything like that in society before, where so many sectors, not just scientists, of course, are stepping up to say, we want to make sure that people are allowed to vote. And again, that is a nonpartisan activity. They're not telling people how to vote. They're just allowing people to exercise their democratic right. A few things that I want to mention is that if we are in a situation of a contested election, which is fairly likely but not certain, we want to be able to provide the information about the course of the vote to those organizations that are involved in litigation. It's really not a good role for UCS to be the litigant. We have many organizations that are positioned to participate in these lawsuits around in particular states and particular counties, but we can be an important source of information and step in where needed. And so we certainly are preparing to do that. We want our members and supporters to have the best information we can and to spread that information to counteract a disinformation campaign. So we will continue to be very active on social media as well as on our own website to try to provide people with the best information we can about what is going on, and hoping that people will then engage with your neighbors, with your local media, with friends and family around the country to ensure that most people actually have good information about what's happening. And just as an aside, you might have seen the stories that in the many lawsuits that have already come up this year that challenge voting and potential for voter fraud, overwhelmingly, judges have rejected the idea that voter fraud is occurring. And their basis for rejecting claims of voter fraud is that there is no evidence, and that the plaintiffs, which have generally been Republican plaintiffs, but I'm not sure that's exclusively true, have not been able to present anything other than supposition that it might occur. And the judges have said you have to at least have some evidence by which to make this claim. Come back when you do. And that's an encouraging sign, because I believe that actually it will be extremely difficult to come by any serious evidence of voter fraud. Even the touted case in Pennsylvania of ballots being thrown in the trash, that was 8 ballots. So it wasn't like a widespread undermining of the voter system in a country of 360 million people. And they retrieved them from the trash. So it is important to continue to push back on misinformation. And then finally, going forward, I would say, UCS is not going to stop working on voting rights and improving our electoral system, even after this most critical election, as Ken has accurately described it. We in Center for Science and Democracy, but I think the whole organization is very supportive of following the election. We really want to fix some of the real challenges that have been revealed by the pandemic and by other crises, as Ken described in this election cycle. So we will actively pursue the National Popular Vote campaign to overcome the challenges of the Electoral College. We will pursue supporting legislation like House Bill 1 and House Bill 4 that tried to level the playing field, restore many of the voting rights that were taken away by recent Supreme Court decisions, and so forth. So this is a longer term program for us, not just a one-time event for this election. You will see Melissa for many years to come, I promise you. But I think it's really important work for us to work on the science of elections. And I'll stop there, Ken, for questions.
Great. Well, thank you both. We've gotten some questions in the Q&A and some questions in the chat, and that's my fault. I should have said at the beginning, if you can put your questions in the Q&A and leave the chat for not questions, but information sharing, that'd be great. But I'll get some questions from both getting started. And while we're doing that, people could start writing in some other questions. So I'll take a couple from the Q&A. Let me read this question. How can we apply pressure as individuals on social platforms so that we all understand that we must learn from the heartbreaking consequences of indefensible, murderous incompetence? I guess the author of this question has a fairly strong opinion. We reject solidarity, disdain expertise, and ignore science at our peril. So I think the question is really about social platforms and the election. Can either of you speak to that?
Do you want to start, Melissa, and then I'll add something?
Sure. I know I just shared a bunch of links in the chat. If you look at the one pushing back against disinformation resources, that's the one that has sort of a step-by-step guide against pushing back against any disinformation. And we know that social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter are known for having a lot of disinformation and misinformation about voting and elections. And so using that resource that I linked to is one way of learning the best practices of pushing back against that, flagging those messages so that hopefully they can be taken down, but also, spreading actual information to your social networks as a way of making sure that they're seeing the facts about voting and elections.
The only thing I'd add is that, a lot of these disinformation campaigns, undermine the democratic process to a great extent, and that's why we see interference from other countries who would like to undermine the democratic process. I've also posted in the chat another Scientific American opinion piece on a scientist sign-on statement in defense of democracy. And so that sign-on statement was started by faculty at Princeton and Columbia working with us in the Federation of American Scientists, pointing out the real move towards autocracy, which is in some ways amplified by social media disinformation, and including out of the White House, although I'm not supposed to say that, am I, Ken? But I urge you to read that statement. When we first posted it in the first weekend, we got 1,500 sign-on. Now we're up to nearly 4,000 scientists who are agreeing with that view. And the reason that I mention that in this context is it is really critical to get other sectors speaking out, much as we have seen around the issues of racism and police violence, where it becomes a sort of national and cultural perspective that yes, this is a problem, and yes, it is unacceptable in the country where the majority of the language is pushing back, and that has to be on the threats to democracy too.
Great, thank you both. Another question, has UCS heard if there is a need for or an opportunity to volunteer to drive disadvantaged voters to early voting or the polls? I've been unable to find resources or information online.
So there is some with local community groups, and the best way to do this is to look locally at the grassroots organizations that are seeking to get out the vote. But if you send me information about where you are located, then I can see if we have any direct contacts at a local level that you could reach out to. Again, there's many grassroots organizations that are helping get out the vote, including campaigns themselves, of course.
Melissa, anything you want to add on that? I'm not asking you to, but just in case, okay. Another question, this is a two-part question. Well, I'll answer the second part because it's easy, but I'll give you guys the hard one. Is there presentation material that we can use to present science and democracy and science of elections? That's the first question. The second is, how many are there in UCS membership? We have approximately 500,000 members and supporters, but could one of you take on the first question? Are there materials we can use to present science and democracy and science of elections?
On the science of elections part of it, there are materials in the papers and fact sheets that Mike Latner has produced and that are on our website. And if you want slides of those, we can make available slides, and we obviously would attribute them to Michael Latner. But on the other issues about resources, Melissa, perhaps you can just describe the things that are available through Science Rising.
Yeah, I talked about some of the resources that are more geared towards faculty and students around voter registration and voter turnout, but I think those could certainly be repurposed. Those are on sciencerising.org. We have template slides there that talk about, yeah, voter registration and voter turnout. Also on that same page on the Science Rising website where we have those slides for you to download, there's a link to the faculty guide for student voting that we co-created with the Scholar Strategy Network. And that has a lot more resources. Again, they're a little bit more focused towards academia and campus engagement, but I think you'd certainly be able to pull from them in terms of, you know, how to talk about the connection between different issue areas, not just science, but different issue areas and policy and democracy.
Thank you. A question, can you predict the impact of the destructive efforts of the postmaster upon mail-in voting?
So we've just completed an analysis, and actually the New York Times has also completed a similar analysis that will be published, I believe, next week, that shows that, once again, there has been, first of all, a dramatic increase in complaints about postal service. In other words, a decline of the service itself, beginning really in April. Now, some of that is COVID, but it also coincides with the new Postmaster General. And that the places, there is a much higher incidence of complaints of people not receiving their mail in minority communities than in wealthier white communities. And so it fits into the pattern that we're seeing across the board as part with voter suppression. There has been substantial pushback, but not to the extent of reinstalling voting sorting machines and so on. So I would have to say that the damage is significant, but it also has, it's angered a lot of people. The post office is one place that everyone knows and generally trusts. And the very idea that you would undermine the postal service, I think, has angered a lot of people and motivated a lot of people to say, I'm going to get that ballot in anyway. So I don't think we can quantify the damage. Certainly the damage was done to the postal service, and in rural areas, it may not be possible to, do other than mail in your ballot. And some of the measures taken in Texas, for example, would mean that, there's one drop box per county, where a county can be, it takes you 3 hours to drive across the county. So there's no question that there is damage, but it's very hard to quantify.
Here's a question. Since almost all of the voting jurisdictions have very long wait times on election day, sorry, let me start again. Since almost all of the voting jurisdictions having very long wait times on election day suffer from using DRE machines, which are unreliable and expensive, therefore not enough of them, what can people do to make states replace those with paper ballots?
There is a move towards paper ballots in many places. It's a very good question. But as you know, elections are under the control of the state. So this isn't a federal responsibility, although there was a significant amount of money in this first stimulus bill to provide support for the election. It wasn't nearly what we and the Brennan Center and other places advocated, to provide states with the money to replace poor equipment and to prepare for mail-in voting. But this isn't something that constituents need to speak out about at the state level and at the county level. And it's really important for people to speak out, not just in the places where there are long lines, But, in communities where, I mean, I can go down the street and vote in 15 minutes, but I do it on a paper ballot in Massachusetts. It's important for everyone in every state where there are struggles, no matter what the community is, wealthy communities, in poorer communities, to speak out to the need to modernize and have paper ballots with appropriate machines to read those ballots and checks on the system. Melissa, I don't know if you have anything else on that.
I mean, not specifically on that, but I'll just add that, Andy touched on some of the systemic ways that we see our electoral system being broken and in dire need of fixing. But there are also, more nitty gritty ways like these DRE machines, right? And that's why we will be continuing to focus on the need for electoral reforms into 2021 and beyond. Like this work will not stop November 3rd or whenever there is a presidential president nominated.
I mean, just one thing to add to that, it's a really important point. The U.S. sends election monitors all around the world to emerging democracies, but some of the practices in our own country actually wouldn't pass muster for those election monitors. And so we need to get our own house in order.
Yeah, good point. Let me take a couple of questions from the chat. Where can we find out which counties are problematic in which state, especially Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, which I can travel to easily, and how to help there?
So if you look at I think it's the most recent blog, or the most recent but one, by Mike Latner on our website, he actually has a description of counties and reference to databases for critical counties. We'll continue to be monitoring those counties in exactly those states that you mentioned, as well as some others. So you should look to that blog as a source, and we'll be continuing to provide maps. One thing you can't do in most places is you can't go collect ballots from somebody and put them in a Dropbox. So you need to be very careful about that. Not only would it invalidate the ballots, but it's a felony, and we really don't want you to go to jail. So but you can help in other ways with local efforts. And again, it's the grassroots organizations that are doing the most to try to overcome the immediate obstacles that are in place and aren't going to change before the election, and get people to the polls or get them able to fill out their ballots.
This question is a little bit similar to something you pointed out, Andy. Have any third parties, e.g. from other countries, validated the vote counting machines like the Diebold machines? How do we have any confidence that these machines are not hacked to skew the vote?
Well, I know that there has been some investigation into hacking of voting machines, but I don't really know the status of it. It is an ongoing threat. It's something that the FBI has certainly investigated to some extent. But we haven't been involved in the investigations of actual, any cyber attacks on voting systems, but it's a serious concern.
I'm going to give a minute for others who haven't had a chance to type in a question and see if there are some more questions. I'll ask this question while we're waiting, but we're almost at the end of the queue. So if people have more questions, please do that. Can NGOs fund modern secure voting tools in some disadvantaged counties, or does that violate 501c3 status?
Ken, do you know the answer to that? Because I don't.
Yeah, I don't think it would violate 501c3 status, but it would be certainly a substantial expansion of our own mission to do that. I really do think that it's incumbent upon government to provide the right equipment so people can vote conveniently and fairly and safely and accurately. I think that where we will steer is to keep that pressure up. And as Melissa pointed out, that's hardly going to stop on November 3rd. In fact, depending upon the election results, there may be a real opportunity to have, as a matter of federal law, which would then be binding on all the states, a series of measures that would make voting a lot better than it is now. So I think that our perspective will be ensuring that federal, state, and local governments do what's needed to make voting fair and safe. I don't think we'd be in a position to fund the voting machines ourselves. Any other questions? I'm scrolling through. Actually, it looks like there have been some. What is the latest on the California Republican drop box fakes that may be used to dump Democratic votes?
So the latest is that was uncovered, widely publicized, was clearly declared illegal, but I don't know what has been done to recover any votes that actually ended up in those drop boxes. So that's one of that's one of the challenges. I mean, was damage done? However, again, in every state, you are allowed to find out whether your ballot was received, whether it was rejected, or whether it was counted. And, you know, I don't know your own experience with calling county offices. Mine is that often the first answer is no. But in fact, legally, they have to provide that information. So, you know, I think the best thing that people can do is to, you know, pursue this and help pursue it for others. And that's why we're calling in and trying to figure out the number of ballots sent out, the number returned, and the number rejected on a county by county basis.
Here's a question that I think's on probably everyone's mind. Are there any states that do not have a paper copy if a recount is needed?
Yes, I believe there are. I think Georgia doesn't have a paper counting copy. I believe there are others, but I certainly know Georgia doesn't. I don't think Alabama does. I don't know comprehensively. That's something that Mike Latner might know, but I didn't get that number into my head. But there certainly are some that do not have paper copies. And there has been a campaign to demand paper ballots in a lot of places because of the concerns over recounts or machines crashing or those sorts of things.
Melissa, here's a question for you. When we post on social media about voting to save science, what hashtags are recommended?
Good question. Obviously, I'll plug hashtag Science Rising. That's a good positive one. But I would also, I feel like hashtags change all of the time. Some things to look for could be Vote Early Day. That's coming up October 24th. It would be great if you posted on that day with some Vote Early Day hashtags, but also, you know, any science relevant ones that you like to use. There's also hashtag Fight Disinfo. That was based on our Twitter chat that happened earlier this afternoon, but I think will continue to be a good resource to address misinformation on social media. And if you're involved in any organizations or upcoming events or conferences, like feel free to use those hashtags, but also include the information about voting and pushing back against disinformation. I think really the wider that you can spread it, the better.
Great. And there was a request to post again the websites that we posted at the beginning of this webinar. So maybe while we're finishing up, we could do that. And that we'll get those posted in the chat box.
I apologize. I've been struggling with sharing links today, so I'll make sure that I'll try to repost some. Maybe we can also share them in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah, I'm sure we can. Okay, well, I think we're out of questions. Oh, wait, there is one more. This is a good one. Who do you contact to find out what the status is of your vote? I assume that means like a mail-in ballot to make sure that it's being processed and accepted. Who would you call?
You actually call your county elector elections office. Now, in some places you can call the city, clerk. That would probably be the first place to start, but things are collected by county then, or by, I think it's all collected by county regardless of congressional district. But depending on where you live, so I live in Gloucester, Massachusetts, I would start with the city clerk's office, but then go on to Essex County and the Board of Elections. But the Board of Elections is responsible ultimately for tallying all the votes, and they are again required to let you know if your ballot has been received or rejected, or if it has been rejected. And I'm pretty sure that's true everywhere, but we're trying to check on that. Legally, I think they have to provide that information everywhere.
And I see, I just encourage people there, several people just wrote into the chat function websites that you can connect to find out the status of your ballot. So I'm sure that would be quite helpful too. Okay, well, this has been great. I want to thank our panelists for answering all these questions. I have to say, as I read them, I was figuring at least a couple of them were going to stump you and you wouldn't be able to answer them. So I'm impressed. And I'm also very impressed by the number of people who have signed in and have asked such good questions. We've got 19 days. I know that a big thing on everyone's mind is what happens if this election is contested, and Andy said that's highly likely, but keep this in mind that the amount of the margin is inversely correlated with the contestability of the election. So there is no better cure for the anxieties we all feel about a contested election than for one of the candidates to win by such a large margin that it becomes, as a practical matter, incontestable. And so with that, I hope that you'll take advantage of all the different tools that Melissa has talked about to help us boost the vote, that you'll vote not only on your own behalfs, but you'll get 3 friends to vote and they'll get 3 friends to vote. 19 days is not a very long time. And right now, this should be all gas and no brakes. So with that, I wish you all the best and thank you for spending some time with us. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.